The scream never had a chance to reach the air. In the sweltering darkness of an August night in Gainesville, Florida, a shadow slipped through a student apartment like a phantom. The summer of 1990 was supposed to be the season of new beginnings for thousands of young people moving into campus housing. But for one man, it was the season of blood. Danny Rolling, the figure who would later be remembered as the Gainesville Ripper, moved with a predator's calm, knife in hand, breath steady. He seemed more like a creature of instinct than a man. That night, two roommates Sonia Larson and Christina Powell had settled into the excitement of their new college lives. They unpacked, laughed, made plans for classes, and drifted off into the fragile peace of sleep. It was a peace Rolling shattered. He entered silently, watching them with the cold detachment of a hunter. Later, police would describe the scene as one of the most horrific they had ever encountered. Bodies posed, mutilated, arranged like some kind of grotesque display. It was not simply murder. It was theater, staged by a man whose entire life had spiraled toward violence. What Gainesville didn't know in those first desperate hours was that Rolling wasn't finished. He was only beginning. By dawn, news began to ripple across campus. 2 students dead. By the following nights, more lives would be stolen. Tanya Bennett, Manuel Taboada, Tracy Pauls. Each scene carried the same signature of cruelty, the same ritualistic posing of bodies. Students began to sleep in groups. Some fled town altogether, and Gainesville transformed from a place of excitement into a city paralyzed by fear. Helicopters hovered over neighborhoods. Police cruisers circled like vultures. Parents called their children relentlessly, demanding updates every hour. For Rolling, this chaos was intoxicating. He thrived on fear, on the knowledge that he was in control while an entire city held its breath. It wasn't enough to kill. He needed to be remembered, to carve his name into the psychology of Gainesville, into the collective memory of anyone who dared to close their eyes at night. And that's exactly what he did. The investigation was frantic. Law enforcement combed through forensic evidence, piecing together fibers, DNA samples, and behavioral patterns. The brutality suggested a man who wasn't simply opportunistic. He was methodical, organized, and ritualistic. Investigators even called in profilers who warned that Rolling wouldn't stop until he was caught. They were right. Yet behind the violence was a man shaped by trauma and resentment. Rolling grew up in a household dominated by an abusive father. He had learned early that violence was both language and power. Over time, it calcified into obsession with control, with domination, with leaving behind something darker than death itself. His murders were not accidents of rage. They were performances. The media lashed onto the story, branding him the Gainesville Ripper. National headlines blared warnings about the monster terrorizing college students. Even decades later, his crimes would haunt pop culture, inspiring movies, books, and endless retellings. His legacy became immortal, though born in blood, and for a certain kind of mind, that legacy was alluring. Years later, in a different state, in a different decade, another man would pore over the Gainesville Ripper's crimes. With something more than morbid curiosity, he would see Rolling not just as a killer, but as a model and architect of fear. Someone who proved that terror could outlive the man who caused it. That man was Bryan Kohberger. But in Gainesville, in the heat of 1990, no one could imagine what Rolling's shadow would inspire. As police closed in on their suspect, the city waited for justice. When Danny Rolling was finally caught, arrested after a string of robberies that seemed unrelated at first, investigators began to piece together his true story. In custody, he confessed to his crimes in chilling detail, never flinching, never softening the truth of what he had done. His words dripped with a strange pride, as if he knew his name would never be forgotten. "I've seen the devil's work," one investigator muttered after reviewing the case files, "and his name is Danny Rolling." The trial that followed sealed his fate. He was sentenced to death. Yet even as he faced execution, Rolling clung to his identity as a monster, On the day of his lethal injection in 2006, he sang a hymn, his voice echoing through the death chamber. Some witnesses wept, others felt only anger, but all of them knew they were watching the final act of a man who had built his legacy from terror. And somewhere, years later, Bryan Kohberger would study the legacy. To the world, Danny Rolling's chapter had closed, but for Kohberger, it had just opened. Because Rolling's murders weren't just random to him, they were a blueprint, a map of obsession, control, and the intoxicating rush of dominance. And when Kohberger walked into a university town decades later, he carried Rolling's shadow with him. The Gainesville Ripper had sown seeds of fear in 1990. No one could have known they would sprout again in the mind of another man. And that man was already planning. The first thing people noticed about Bryan Kohberger wasn't his presence, it was his absence. He often seemed to exist on the edges of a room, hovering in the background, watching, analyzing. Teachers would later describe him as intelligent, sometimes brilliant, but socially awkward. Classmates remembered a tall, quiet boy with eyes that didn't always meet yours. A young man who carried himself like someone rehearsing for a role no one else understood. But beneath the silence, there was restlessness. Kohberger grew up in Pennsylvania, in the Poconos, a region of thick woods, quiet roads, and small-town routines. From the outside, his childhood looked ordinary. His parents were working class, his home stable enough. But internally, Bryan wrestled with a gnawing emptiness. He wanted control, belonging, recognition, and yet the world rarely gave him any of it. Friends from his teenage years recalled a boy who struggled with his weight, who was often bullied, and who in turn lashed out with words sharper than knives. He could be cruel, one former classmate admitted, like he wanted you to feel small, because he always felt small. That cruelty was paired with a fascination for crime and psychology. He wanted to understand people, but not in the way most of us do. For Bryan, understanding meant finding their weak points. It meant pulling apart the threads of human behavior until nothing was left but raw exposure. By the time he reached college, the fascination had hardened into obsession. He studied criminology, devouring textbooks and case studies the way some students devour novels. He wasn't just interested in how crimes were solved, he was enthralled by the criminals themselves. The more notorious, the better. And it was in that search for a dark mentor that he discovered Danny Rolling. Rolling's story wasn't just another case file to Bryan. It was a mirror. Here was a man who had grown up under abuse, who had been dismissed and overlooked, who had found his voice not in words but in violence. Rolling's Gainesville murders were horrific, but to Kohberger, they represented something else. A blueprint for seizing control, for etching one's name into history through fear. As Bryan pored over details of Rolling's crimes, he wasn't horrified. He was captivated. He studied Rolling's methods, the careful stalking, the ritualistic posing of victims, the way he forced an entire community into paralyzing terror. To Bryan, this wasn't madness, it was mastery. Meanwhile, those closest to him began to notice changes. His former friends recalled conversations that seemed increasingly dark, his questions about morality unsettling. He wanted to know what it felt like to take a life. He wanted to know if killers felt guilt or if, perhaps, they felt powerful. During graduate school, Kohberger's focus sharpened even more. He conducted surveys on criminal offenders, asking them questions like, how did you approach your victim? And how did you leave the crime scene? On the surface, it was academic research. But to those who would later look back, it was something else entirely, a chilling foreshadowing of his own intentions. In online forums, he posted anonymously about his struggles with disconnection, describing himself as trapped in a fog, unable to feel emotion, watching life pass by as though he were already dead. He confessed to feeling like a shadow drifting through the world, invisible yet suffocatingly present. And yet, Rolling's story gave him an anchor. Rolling had transformed his own insignificance into infamy. He had proven that even a nobody could become unforgettable. If only he was willing to cross the darkest threshold. The seed had been planted. Still, Kohberger was careful. Outwardly, he played the role of the dedicated academic. He spoke confidently in classes, challenged professors, even impressed some with his sharp analyses. But behind the facade was a man rehearsing, preparing, learning. Just as Rowling had staged his crime scenes, Kohberger was staging his life, building a persona that concealed the predator beneath. It's tempting to wonder if anyone could have stopped him, if anyone could have recognized what was festering inside. But predators like Bryan are skilled at hiding in plain sight. They thrive on invisibility until the moment they choose to reveal themselves. And Bryan was waiting for that moment. He followed news of Rowling obsessively, watching old interviews, reading transcripts, studying every forensic detail. Rowling had chosen a university town, a place filled with young people, with innocence and promise. To Bryan, that was no accident. College campuses represented not only opportunity, but symbolism. They were sanctuaries of growth and freedom. And to destroy that sanctity was to send a message that would echo far beyond the crime scene. Bryan understood this, and he admired it. But admiration alone was never going to be enough. For years, he simmered in the tension between curiosity and compulsion. He wanted to know what it would feel like to cross the line. He wanted to prove to himself, to the world, that he could be more than a shadow, that he could step into the light of infamy, just as Rowling had. Friends drifted away. Relationships fractured. The more isolated he became, the deeper he sank into his studies, his fantasies, his quiet rehearsals. He began to see people not as individuals, but as patterns, variables in a psychological experiment he longed to conduct in the real world. And as his academic career advanced, so did his fixation. The Gainesville Ripper had been executed, but his shadow lived on in Bryan's mind, in his notebooks, in his secret hunger. By the time he applied to Washington State University's graduate program in criminology, Bryan was no longer just a student of crime. He was an apprentice. He was sharpening his tools, choosing his stage, and biding his time. Somewhere, deep down, he already knew he wasn't going to spend his life merely reading about killers. He was going to become one. The knife glimmered in Bryan Kohberger's imagination long before it touched reality in his mind. He rehearsed every detail, the approach, the entry, the silence. Just as Danny Rowling had prowled Gainesville in the shadows, Bryan began prowling Pullman and Moscow, to quiet university towns straddling the Washington-Idaho border. To the students who filled these towns, life was a swirl of lectures, late-night pizza, and house parties. To Bryan, it was a hunting ground waiting to be mapped. Neighbors noticed him sometimes, a tall man with hollow cheeks and sharp eyes, moving with an intensity that seemed almost out of place. He drove his white Hyundai Elantra along back roads, sometimes circling neighborhoods in the dead of night. One neighbor recalled, it felt like he was watching more than living. Another described seeing his car pass by so often it became unnerving. He was watching, always watching. Bryan studied criminology at Washington State University, yet while his peers approached the field to solve crimes, he approached it to dissect them. Professors noted his confidence, his eagerness to challenge ideas, but classmates whispered about something colder beneath his questions. He wanted to know not just how crimes were solved, but how criminals perfected their methods. He pressed discussions about the psychology of killers, about their control, about their rituals. The Gainesville Ripper was never far from his thoughts. Just as Danny Rowling had chosen a campus filled with youth and vulnerability, Bryan gravitated towards students bright, hopeful, and unsuspecting. He tracked patterns, observing when people left their homes, when they returned, when they turned off the lights. He was meticulous. Rowling had taught him that terror wasn't random. It was curated. By the fall of 2022, Kohberger had zeroed in on a house on King Road in Moscow, Idaho. It was a 3-story rental home shared by University of Idaho students. From the outside, it looked like any other college house, laughter spilling from windows, music thumping during weekends, lights flickering late into the night. Inside lived for young women, Kaylee Goncalves, Maddie Morgan, Shauna Kernodle, and Xana's boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, who often stayed overnight. They had no idea someone had been circling their lives. Bryan had driven past the King Road house at least a dozen times in the months leading up to November. Surveillance cameras later captured his white Hyundai Elantra circling the neighborhood. In the early hours of the morning, to police, these were just patterns revealed after the fact. To Bryan, they were practice runs. He studied their routines, just as Rolling had done in Gainesville. Bryan needed to know his victims before he struck. Rolling's crimes were never just about killing, they were about power, control, and the intimacy of intrusion. Bryan mirrored the psychology. The students in that house weren't strangers to him. They were pieces in his design. The night of November 12, 2022, unfolded like any other Saturday in Moscow. Students flooded the streets, bars echoed with music, and laughter spilled into the cold Idaho air. At the King Road house, Kaylee and Maddie went out with friends. Enjoying what seemed like an ordinary night, Shauna and Ethan spent the evening together, sharing food, scrolling through their phones, living the fleeting, simple joys of college life. But Bryan was already out there, circling. Just after 3 a.m., his white Hyundai was spotted again, creeping past the King Road house. Inside, the students had returned, some drifting into sleep, some still awake. Outside, Bryan rehearsed the steps Rolling had once taken in Gainesville, waiting for the moment when the house grew silent, when darkness covered every window. Around 4 a.m., the car made its final pass. It parked nearby, and then the shadow moved. Authorities would later reconstruct the sequence of events from surviving roommates, phone records, and forensic evidence. What happened inside that house was chaos, terror, and violence. Bryan slipped inside, knife in hand, just as Rolling had done decades earlier. The attack was swift, brutal. Kaylee and Maddie never had time to react. Shauna and Ethan fought, their resistance fierce. But the knife was merciless. When it was over, Bryan vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of devastation. For young lives, full of hope and promise, extinguished in minutes. But in his careful planning, Bryan made mistakes, just as Rolling had left clues, fibers, DNA, a signature Bryan left behind his own trail. On a knife sheath abandoned at the scene, investigators recovered DNA. Surveillance cameras captured his car. Cell phone records betrayed his movements. The parallels between him and Danny Rolling were uncanny. Both had stocked university towns. Both had chosen students. Both had treated murder not just as violence, but as a stage for control. But Bryan, for all his studies, for all his admiration of Rolling, overlooked one truth: the arrogance of killers is often their undoing. In the days after the murders, Moscow fell into the same kind of fear Gainesville once knew. Students packed bags and fled home. Parents demanded their children withdraw from classes. Helicopters hovered above. Police cars roamed neighborhoods. The town was suffocating under terror. Bryan watched. Neighbors would later say he seemed unaffected, calm, even oddly curious about the case. Some classmates recalled him raising questions in class about the investigation, almost testing the waters of knowledge. He wanted to know what evidence police might have. One student remembered, like he was checking his own blind spots. Rolling had relished watching Gainesville descend into fear. Bryan did the same in Moscow. Both men had taken something fragile: youth, innocence, community, and shattered it for their own twisted validation. But while Rolling was eventually caught through a string of robberies that linked him to the murders, Bryan's downfall would come from the very science he thought he understood better than anyone: forensic evidence. For now, though, in those first chaotic weeks, Bryan felt invisible. He had crossed the line he'd fantasized about for years. He was no longer just a student of killers. He was one, and the hunt to unmask him had only just begun. The silence in Moscow after the murders was not peace, it was paralysis. Streets once buzzing with students now felt deserted. Windows glowed late into the night as roommates huddled together, too afraid to sleep alone. In coffee shops, conversations dropped to whispers. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was it a serial killer? Was it targeted? Could the murderer be among us? For investigators, the pressure was suffocating. They had for young victims, a terrified community, and almost no public leads. But behind closed doors, the investigation was already narrowing in. The killer had left something crucial behind, a knife sheath stamped with the U.S. Marine Corps' insignia. On its button snap, technicians recovered a single trace of DNA. It wasn't a complete profile, but it was enough to set the chase in motion. Detectives also began combing through hours of surveillance footage. At first, it seemed overwhelming, dozens of cars passing by the King Road neighborhood on that cold November night, but one stood out, a white Hyundai Elantra. Its movements were strange, circling the block multiple times before vanishing into the night around the time of the murders. The car became their ghost. Meanwhile, Bryan Kohberger carried on his routine. He attended classes at Washington State University, submitted assignments, held conversations with classmates. Some even recalled him acting oddly fascinated by the murders. In one discussion, he allegedly leaned forward, asking, "So, who do you think the killer is?" His tone was calm, almost clinical. But while he blended in by day, investigators were quietly closing the gap by night. The white Hyundai registered to Kohberger quickly became a focal point. Detectives tracked its movements not only in Moscow but across state lines. Security footage confirmed it had been near the King Road house multiple times before the murders. The pattern was unmistakable: stalking. Phone records told an even darker story. When Bryan's cell data was pulled, investigators discovered that his phone had pinged near the King Road house at least a dozen times in the months leading up to the murders, always late at night, always when the house was quiet. It was a chilling revelation. He hadn't just killed. He had studied. He had rehearsed. Yet Kohberger made one fatal mistake. During the murders, he turned his phone off, attempting to erase his digital trail. But in the minutes before and after, the device flickered back to life, connecting to nearby towers. Investigators now had a breadcrumb trail that led directly to him. The parallels to Danny Rolling were eerie. Rolling, too, had stalked his victims, watching them long before he struck. He, too, had left behind traces of himself in fibers and DNA and careless mistakes. For all their obsession with control, both men had overlooked the one thing they could never fully command: evidence. By December, law enforcement had their suspect, but suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof. That's when investigators turned to an unconventional strategy: genetic genealogy. Using the DNA from the knife sheath, analysts built a family tree, combing through public databases of relatives and distant matches. It was a painstaking process, but eventually the branches led back to one name: Bryan Kohberger. To confirm, investigators needed a direct sample. Surveillance teams began tailing Bryan, collecting discarded items from the trash outside his family's home in Pennsylvania. They recovered DNA from his father. The match to the crime scene was undeniable. The net had closed, but Kohberger still had no idea. In the days leading up to his arrest, he drove across the country with his father, heading back to Pennsylvania for the holidays. Along highways and gas stations, the white Hyundai slipped through small towns and rest stops, carrying a killer who believed he had outsmarted the system. To his father, it was just a road trip. To Bryan, perhaps, it was a victory lap. Behind the scenes, the FBI and local police coordinated one of the most careful surveillance operations in recent memory. They followed Bryan from state to state, tracking his movements, monitoring his behavior, ensuring he couldn't disappear. Investigators wanted him alive, wanted the trial, wanted the world to see justice unfold. On December 30th, 2022, the silence broke. At 1 a.m., tactical teams surrounded the Kohberger family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Armed officers breached the door, rushing up the stairs. Bryan was pulled from his bedroom, stunned, blinking into the flood of flashlights and shouted commands. In that moment, the mask cracked. The criminology student who had idolized killers, who believed himself untouchable, was now handcuffed in his childhood home. Neighbors awoke to chaos. Some recalled seeing Bryan escorted out in a t-shirt and shorts, his expression blank. Others swore they heard him whisper, "What's going on?" A question that seemed less about confusion and more about denial. News of the arrest exploded across the country. After weeks of fear and speculation, the students of Moscow finally had a name, a face, a monster revealed. But the shock was doubled by the revelation of who he was. Not a drifter, not a stranger, but a criminology PhD student who had studied killers as if preparing for this very role. The irony was unbearable. The man who believed he understood how murders were caught had been undone by the very science he worshipped. Just as Danny Rolling had eventually confessed, proud of his legacy. Bryan Kohberger now faced a future where every detail of his life would be dissected under a microscope. His obsession with Rolling had come full circle. Like his idol, he had terrorized a college town, left behind a trail of fear, and been unmasked by the evidence he couldn't erase. But unlike Rolling, Bryan offered no confession. He stayed silent, denying involvement, his face unreadable in court appearances. Where Rolling sang hymns on his way to execution, Bryan clung to his silence, as though words themselves might betray him. The investigation had caught him. The trial was coming. But the question lingered, heavy and unresolved. Why had Bryan Kohberger, the criminology student, the quiet man from Pennsylvania, chosen to step into Rolling's shadow and make it his own? That answer would only unravel in the months to come. The air inside the courtroom was thick, as if every breath carried the weight of stolen lives. The jury had been gone for hours, and each tick of the clock only deepened the silence. Families of the victims clutched one another's hands, their faces pale from waiting. Reporters sat poised, pens hovering, cameras ready. At the defense table, Bryan Kohberger sat motionless, eyes fixed ahead, his face unreadable. When the jury finally returned, the room shifted. Everyone stood. The foreperson rose, paper trembling slightly in their hand, and delivered the words the families had been praying to hear. Guilty. One by one, the charges were read. Guilty of the murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Morgan, Shauna Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Guilty of breaking into the sanctuary of their home. Guilty of the terror he had inflicted on an entire town. Kaylee's father gripped the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. Madison's mother buried her face into her hands, sobs shaking her shoulders. Xana's siblings leaned into each other, silent tears streaming down their cheeks. Ethan's parents sat upright, holding one another, their grief a quiet storm. Bryan did not flinch. His face remained a mask, the same mask he had worn throughout the trial. If there was fear, regret, or anger inside him, it was locked away, hidden behind eyes that betrayed nothing. The sentencing phase came swiftly. Prosecutors argued for death, citing the brutality of the crime, the premeditation, the sheer callousness of slaughtering for young people in their own beds. They spoke of the community shattered, the fear that lingered in every student who returned to campus, the families forever broken. The defense pleaded for life without parole, arguing Bryan's history of social struggles, his alleged mental health issues, his isolation. They painted him as damaged, not monstrous. But the jury had already seen too much. When the sentence was read, it echoed like a verdict on more than just Bryan Kohberger. Death. Just like Danny Rolling. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Rolling, the Gainesville Ripper, executed in 2006. Singing a hymn as the lethal injection coursed through his veins, Kohberger, now condemned to the same fate, his life narrowed to a countdown in a cell. Both men had terrorized college towns. Both had stalked, studied, and slaughtered students. Both had left communities paralyzed, and both had ended in chains, waiting for the slow machinery of justice to erase them. Yet where Rolling had confessed, almost boasting of his crimes, Kohberger remained silent. Even as sentencing was passed, even as families begged for answers, he offered none. No apology, no explanation, just silence. For the victims' families, justice brought a measure of relief, but not peace. After the verdict, Kaylee's mother stood outside the courthouse, her voice breaking as she told reporters, "We got what we prayed for, but it doesn't bring my daughter back. Nothing ever will." Inside prison walls, Bryan's days became a monotony of routines, steel doors clanging shut, guards patrolling, the weight of time pressing down. In letters seized by investigators, he wrote sparingly, his words detached, almost academic. He dissected his own trial, analyzing where evidence had cornered him, where his planning had faltered. To some, it seemed less like remorse and more like study as students still trapped in his obsession. The chilling thought lingered, had Bryan seen this ending all along? Had he understood, deep down, that like Rolling, his crimes would not end with freedom, but with infamy? In Gainesville, Danny Rolling's shadow had terrified a generation. In Moscow, Bryan Kohberger revived it. One murderer had inspired another, proving that evil can echo across decades, passed like a torch from one broken man to the next. But where Rolling's chapter had closed with a hymn, Kohberger's remains unfinished. Appeals, motions, and years of legal battle stretch ahead. He may wait decades before the final sentence is carried out. Each delay, each headline, each reminder prolongs his presence in the public mind, the very notoriety he seemed to crave. And yet, even if his name fades, the scars remain. The students of Moscow live with a memory that will never vanish. The night innocence was stolen from their quiet town. The families live with empty chairs at dinner tables, birthdays that will never be celebrated, future stolen in the blink of an eye. That is Bryan Kohberger's true legacy, not infamy, not control, not the twisted admiration he felt for Danny Rolling. His legacy is absence, the silence of lives cut short, the echo of laughter that will never return. But there is one last detail that unsettles, one final afterthought that lingers like a shadow at the edge of light. On the day Danny Rolling was executed, he looked into the glass at the witnesses and smiled faintly, as though he had achieved what he always wanted, to be remembered. Bryan Kohberger, sitting in his cell, may believe the same. And that is the most chilling truth of all.